be able to exhaust this topic today or even finish this sermon, but what I'm going to talk to you about this morning is a topic that I'm going to be speaking about. It's a difficult one to talk about. The title of my sermon is Caring for the Poor, and of course this comes out of the book of Proverbs. And the trouble that I have with this topic is the difficulty, and I'm sure many of you feel the same way, is being confident that the money that people ask for from me or even from the church is actually going to meet a legitimate need. You know what I mean? Have you felt that way before? And I think it's especially true when you don't know the person who desires to get help from you. You just don't know them. And you know how it is. Thanks, George. Appreciate you getting that for me. It covers the little trap door that's here. When you don't know those people, you don't want to give money to people who are going to be irresponsible or just who are looking for a handout to use the money on other things that aren't necessities. You don't want to buy someone cigarettes for them. You don't want to buy alcohol for them. You don't want to really be paying their cable bill. You don't want to be really paying their overused credit card bill. And, it's tough because you see the other in the street will work for food, and you wonder, will they really work for food? Because they're actually probably not there for a job. They're looking for some money. And so this is a difficult issue for me on a lot of levels, but you'd think this would actually help the issue, but I think it doesn't help it because there's a contrast. Because I've traveled to third world countries, and I don't mean to say that we don't have poor here in the United States. We obviously do. But when you travel to third world countries, you see people who, and I say the word really, meaning that I'm not saying that there aren't poor people here in the U.S. There certainly are. But you can't help when you go to a third world country like Honduras that there is real poor people there. People who food and clothing are a struggle for them. And So one of the reasons that, remember back even this last year, we gave money to Abraham Thomas because we wanted to take up an offering for the poor. Frankly, we wanted to be pretty sure that it would get to those who really were poor. And remember what Abraham bought with those? He talked to us about what he was going to do. Because in India, there are many, many legitimately poor people. And I remember, and some of you may remember some other things, but I remember they bought blankets with that money. And then they bought goats for people, which I thought was a great way of saying, because you realize more people drink goat milk throughout the world than drink cow's milk. You may or may not realize that. So that really buying them goats was a really, not just a handout, but a way to really stimulate economic and prosperity for these poor village people in India. And frankly, I'm just saying I feel a lot better about that than some of these questions. So I think this is a very valid question to ask. And especially I think it's a part of our stewardship responsibility, is to ask legitimate questions about, are the needs of the people legitimate needs? And unfortunately, even for me, sometimes asking those questions and then learning, after you've given money to people or you find out that, they're going around asking a lot of people for money and they're being irresponsible, it really gets you a little bit jaded, doesn't it? You know what I mean? Toward giving. And so what I'm saying to you is I think those are all legitimate questions to ask about giving to the poor. But I'm just going to tell you this, from this book even alone, and we're going to stay in the book of Proverbs. It is no question from even the book of Proverbs alone, from this one Bible book, and we could go to other places to rationalize it, but we have a responsibility to the poor. I just want to let you know that no matter how difficult it is with all these legitimate questions, we have a responsibility to the poor. So let's get started, caring for the poor in Proverbs. And so my first point is this: God will bless or people will curse. God will bless, people will curse. Proverbs 28, verse 27. He who gives to the poor will lack nothing, but he who closes his eyes to them receives many curses. He who gives to the poor will lack nothing, but he who closes his eyes to them receives many curses. And what this is in Proverbs is this way many times. This is a generalized promise, meaning most times it's true. It doesn't mean there can't be exceptions to the rule. That is the way Proverbs is. They're generalized promises from the Lord. This is a generalized promise from the Lord that if we give to the poor from what we have, and you got to remember, what we have all came from who? God anyway. You have to understand that. Sometimes we take such ownership of our money, we think it's our money. Even the money and the property and the things that we own, that comes from the Lord anyway. God is saying when we give to the poor, which came from the Lord anyway, God will make sure that we have enough. Now listen to how this is stated even more strongly in Proverbs chapter 11. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 24 through 26. It's interesting. It says, "One man gives freely, yet gains even more. Another one withholds, but comes to poverty. The generous man, he's going to prosper. He who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. People curse the man who hoards grain, but blessing crowns him who is willing to share." It's a great illustration of all the different ways to look at this problem. And to me, it's like God is saying, if you give out of what I've given to you, and you're concerned about that loss, God is saying, don't be so worried about that, because in the first place, I gave you what you had in the first place. And God's saying, I will make up for that loss. Now, that doesn't mean just because you see a poor person, you say, well, I need to give to them. You've got to take stock of your resources and what you can do. I'm not minimizing that. But thankfully, in the culture that we live in, many of us have more money than just food and shelter and things. God has blessed us with more. But if we ignore the poor, like closing our eyes to them or hoarding our wealth, and in this part it's saying grain, it's using grain as an example. It says this, if we hoard it or we ignore them by closing our eyes to them, the poor will curse us because we had the ability to help them and we didn't do it. Now, I'm sure one time or another, it doesn't mean economically that this is true, but just some other illustration. Think of some time when you needed someone else's help. I don't know what it is. You locked your keys in your car, you need a jump, you've lost something, whatever it is. Probably sometime in your life, you had some kind of need, and you approached someone to meet that need, and they just didn't do it. How did you feel about them? I bet you didn't want to bless them. You know, come on. I mean, I'm not asking too much of you. You have enough, Can I borrow your cell phone? Or I didn't think if I jumped the battery off your car that it would suck all the energy out of your car and you wouldn't be able to start yours either, I mean, there's just been times when you've asked something legitimate of someone who had something in need and they're just, for whatever reason, they just stiff-arm you. And so God is just reminding, when you do that to other people, don't think that people are going to bless you for it. They're going to curse you for it. The point of this verse is that we need to observe and take seriously the needs of other people. When it's within our power to act, we should. And God has given us extra stuff for a reason. And part of that is to meet the needs of other people. Sometimes we just have a tendency to think the reason we have extra is because we're going to now be able to retire. It's like everything's going toward that. And that's an important thing. The Bible talks about saving. But sometimes God has given us a little cream on the top so we can share it with someone else in need. And so I think we need to be thinking about that. We as Americans, and maybe I'm speaking for myself a little too much here, we are so jaded about giving sometimes that we just think it's too complicated, you can't trust anybody, and as a result, we don't give the way that we need to. But I'm going to tell you, even as someone who through the years has represented the Baptist Children's Home, I could come into a church like ours and I'd say, I am here for you to help orphan and needy children. And you would be surprised how many people take out their checkbooks and say, God has given me some cream and I'm going to use it to help other people. And that whole ministry operates by people just doing that. Number 2, God will punish those who disregard or take advantage of the poor. God will punish those who disregard or take advantage of the poor. Proverbs 14:31. He who opposes the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. Proverbs 17:5. He who mocks the poor shows contempt for their maker. Whoever gloats over disaster will not go unpunished. You can see the contrast here. One person honors God by being kind to the poor, and the other shows contempt for God by oppressing the poor. Notice how God, in his word, takes ownership of the poor and of their plight. He takes ownership of it. And we're going to read a really strong statement further down in the sermon. I don't know if we can get there. It's a statement from God concerning that. But when it comes to the poor, we need to remember where we came from. When it comes to the poor, we need to remember where we came from. And when I say that, I'm not saying it is true for a number of us here. Some of us came from poor families. And we're in a better economic condition than maybe our parents were or our grandparents. And that's not what I'm saying here. I'm not saying we need to remember that we came from the rich part of town or the poor part of town, and that gives us perspective. Look at Proverbs 22:2 and Proverbs 29:13. This is the perspective that we need to remember. Rich and poor have this in common. The Lord is maker of them all. Proverbs 29:13, the poor man and the oppressor have this in common. So the poor man and even people who take advantage of the poor have this in common. The Lord gives sight to the eyes of both. And what this is referring to is our origins. You know, today we're always talking about origins, evolution, where did we come from? Our origin is the fact that we were created by God. Amen? That's our origin. And it's talking about God as being our maker, God as being our creator. And you know, you've heard it before. I'll put it in the vernacular. I'll put it more. God don't make no junk. God don't make no junk. That's us, rich or poor. He doesn't make any junk. We're all made in the image of God, and we deserve respect on that status alone. Amen? On that status alone. I hope you realize that is one of the strong arguments about the unnecessary death of children in abortion, is the fact that God has made children in his image. They deserve respect. They deserve status because they are made in the image of God. And what it's saying here is you'll see there are real repercussions for not helping those in need. And what God is saying is, when we ignore the poor, it's an insult to him. He takes it as a personal insult. Now, if you were to walk out of church today, and Kathy hasn't allowed me to put my sob on the insurance, but she said this week I can put it on. If you were to walk out there and see the keys for my sob, and you knew they were my keys, would you be kind enough to pick them up and walk them into the church and give them to me? I hope you would. Some of you may drive it for a while. Good luck. It's not that good of a car. It looks better than it drives. You would bring those keys to me and you'd give them back, because whose car is it? It's my car. The poor are God's. They're his. He doesn't want you to ignore them. In India, I've told you the story before, we walked into what would be the jungle. That's what they would call it. To me, it looked like the woods. We walk into the woods and it looks like there's nothing there. And then I told you before, we looked there and all of a sudden I realized, because all the houses are made out of mud and like leaves and, you know what I mean, the parts of palm trees are on the roof. It just totally blended in. So you can't see that there's people living there. Then you realize, no, there's a house here, but it just totally blends in because it's all mud in these huts. And then I'm saying to Abraham as he's showing, we walk in and there's this gleaming white little church that would be this. The foyer is a lot bigger than this church building, but it was gleaming white church. In the middle, and he said, Bill, do you know what a difference this church building means in this village? And I'm thinking, how many people live in a village like this? 5,000-10,000 people, live in this village? He goes, no, a lot more people live in here than that. You just don't realize it because there's not high rises or anything or street lights or lamp. So a village in the middle of the woods is highly populated. And so he's showing me the church, and we walk into the church. It's just got a cement floor. That church back then probably cost $2,500, $3,000 to build. You guys know who've been around. Abraham was raising money for that, and people from our church helped build these churches. And from our community helped build these churches. And so Abraham is showing the church, and this man is following us around. He's not saying anything, but he's following us around. He's wearing a white thing wrapped around him. I don't think he had a shirt. He was skin and bones. And he was following us around. And then I looked at him, and one of his eyes was all whited out. You could tell he was blinded in the one eye. And the skinny man is following us around. And then Abraham turns and talks to him. I mean, he wasn't ignoring him, but it was obvious this man was following us. Abraham finally turns around and talks to the man. And then Abraham gives him some money. And I turned to Abraham and I said, tell me about that, because they were speaking in their native tongue that I wouldn't know what it was. And Abraham said, that man is poor, and he doesn't have anything. And I'm just telling you, we talk about Jesus, all he said that all I had was the robe on me. This is what this guy's walking around in. And he said, I don't have any, this man doesn't have anything, he's poor. And Abraham gave him money. And I said, Abraham, this is foreign to us in the U.S., this thing. And I said, Abraham, can you tell me, because I'm being nosy, but I want to know, how much money did you give him, and what was this all about? And I think Abraham said back then, it would have been Abraham gave him about 50 cents. Back then, I think a rupee was 45 rupees to $1 or something. So maybe he gave him like 20 rupees or something like that, less than 50 cents. And I said, what did you do? And he said, Bill, that will buy him his breakfast. We can't ignore this person who's following us around. Now, it's different here in the U.S. because they aren't, you know what I mean? Starvation isn't the issue here generally, but it can be, so don't underestimate that. If you want to give money to the poor here in the U.S., you got to do some research to make sure it's getting to the people that you need to get it to. In India, it was as simple as turning that. And so if Abraham closed his eyes to the poor, what would have been saying about that poor skinny man who was standing there? Do you know what I mean? It would be an affront to God for him to ignore him. Because that man with that bad eye and the poor skin and bones man was made in the same image of God as we were. So I would just say this. We'll stop here because we're going to go to communion. Is that we're all made in the image of God. And we can't close our eyes to the poor. So I would just say this to you, and it's a question that I have for myself. How am I being sure that I am not closing my ears or my eyes to the poor? How am I making sure that with my excess, I am doing something for the poor? It's just a valid point.